Hi friends, today we will study a short story written by K S Duggal, and the title of this short story is A Room 10 by 8. So before I begin, just let me tell you something. ನನ್ನ ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳು ನನಗೆ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿವರಿಸಲು ಮನವಿಯನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿರುತ್ತಾರೆ. ಆದರೆ ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳೇ, ತಾವು ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಉತ್ತರಗಳನ್ನು ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿಯೇ ಬರೆಯಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಅತಿ ಮಹತ್ವದ ಒಂದು ವಿಷಯ ಅಂದರೆ, ಈಗ ತಾವು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಅಂಡರ್ ಗ್ರ್ಯಾಜುಯೇಟ್ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಇರೋ ಕಾರಣ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಭಾಷೆಯನ್ನು ಇಂಪ್ರೂವ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ನಾನು ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ವಿವರಿಸುವಾಗ ಕಠಿಣ ಪದಗಳ ಅರ್ಥವನ್ನು ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳಿರುತ್ತೇನೆ. ನಾನು ಸಾಧ್ಯವಾದಷ್ಟು ಸರಳ ಭಾಷೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ವಿವರಣೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೇನೆ. So this is a short story. It is written by an Indian writer, K S Duggal. In this particular story, the writer tells us about the relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. In our society, we have always seen that there is always a gap of communication, or you can say there is a lack of mutual understanding. Mutual means parasparik. So there is a lack of understanding or lack of mutual understanding, lack of communication between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It is very common in our society that there is always a difference of opinion between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. If you just go through some TV serials, you will see that they are always portrayed as enemies. Portray means vivarisu, bhavachitrisu. So they are always portrayed as enemies. As it happened, Mr. Malik, there are some important characters here. Mr. Malik, Mrs. Malik, these are two important characters. Mr. Malik was a government servant, and he was always transferred from one place to another place after every third year. So after completion of his 3 years of service, he was transferred. He was always transferred from one place to another place. So after repeated transfers, Mr. and Mrs. Malik finally decide that they should have their own house. They think about their children and their education. As you know very well, when you are a government servant, you are serving in public interest, so naturally you will be transferred from one place to another place. So it is very difficult for a government servant to settle at one particular place. So here Mr. Malik and Mrs. Malik, they decide to build their own house in Delhi. In fact, Malik had purchased a plot in the most fashionable colony of the town some time ago. Now when Mr. Malik was transferred to Delhi again, they decide that they should start the construction of their house in Delhi. Mr. Malik had already made up his mind that they should have their own house. His wife, Mrs. Malik, she was thinking of her children and their education. So she has made up her mind that after completion of her house, even if Mr. Malik is transferred to another station, she would stay back in Delhi. In fact, she was very sick of his repeated transfers. As their children were growing up, it was not desirable to shift them from school to school. So she thinks that if Malik is transferred again, let him go alone. She would like to settle in Delhi with her children. She would have her mother in law to keep her company. Now, Mr. Malik had no objection for it. So, naturally, when they decide to construct their own house, Mr. Malik hires an architect, and one day, as they were discussing the plan prepared by the architect, Mr. Malik was attending a telephone call. At that time, when Mrs. Malik looks at the plan, she suggests the architect to redraw the size of the storeroom to 10 by 8. The architect actually tries to the architect tries to explain Mrs. Malik that it would be bigger in size for a storeroom. But Mrs. Malik tells him that as her mother-in-law is old and weak, she would like to use it for her mother-in-law. So as they are about to start their construction, so an architect has already designed a plan, and Mrs. Malik suggests that the size of the storeroom should be 10 by 8, though it is a little bit bigger in size. Mrs. Malik would like to use that room for her old mother-in-law. She would use it as a storeroom after the death of her mother-in-law. Here, the architect looks puzzled. Architect look puzzled means he is very much surprised. Gondal Gidago. Mr. Malik too was of the opinion that the storeroom should be a little bigger as it would accommodate their trunks more freely. So Mr. Malik also approves the size because he thinks that if you have a big storeroom, you can accommodate their trunks more freely and the room would be very clean. Besides, it would be more convenient to keep it clean. So they decide that the room adjacent means pakkada to the kitchen would be of 10 by 8. Now the construction begins, and when the construction begins, Mrs. Malik can be seen standing with an umbrella supervising the work throughout the day. So when their house was being constructed, it was the responsibility of Mrs. Malik to go and supervise the work. She used to be the first person to arrive, Agamisu, and the last person to depart at the construction site. She would be the first person to come and she would be the last person to go. Arrive means agamisu, depart means nirgamisu. Before the completion of the construction, Mrs. Malik wanted to have new furniture made for her new house. She would not let the old furniture enter the new house, not a piece of it. Now, as the construction gets completed, unfortunately, the house gets acquired by the government for emergency purposes. Acquire means ಸ್ವಾಧೀನಪಡಿಸಿಕೊ. The house is the construction of the house is completed, and as they are about to move into their new house, the government acquires the house for emergency purposes. Purpose means uddesha. Emergency means turta paristiti. Mrs. Malik gets very angry, but her anger subsides. Subside means ili, shantavagu. As she learns from Mr. Malik that the government would be giving rent for their house. So when she comes to know from her husband that government would be giving sufficient rent, she calms down. While supervising the construction of the house, she had a number of plans. She had made a number of friends in the colony. She wanted to decorate her new house. She even wanted to invite all her friends. But as their house was acquired by the government, she had to forget all her plans. In the meantime, ಈ ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ again they are transferred from Delhi. Mrs. Malik now looks happy because she would no more see her house and regret for not being able to live in her own house. Regret means marugu. After many repeated transfers, again Mr. Malik was posted in Delhi. Meanwhile, Mrs. Malik's mother-in-law dies. So even before they move to their new house, Mrs. Malik's mother-in-law dies. Their daughter gets married. They even thank God for their house being rented by the government. They think that they were lucky that their house had been rented to the government, because according to them, private tenants, ಬಾಡಿಗೆದಾರರು, are always headaches because they never pay their rents on time. Now, before his retirement, Mr. Malik thinks that his son should get married. So even before his retirement, his son also gets married. Now, Mr. Malik retires from his services. Even after his retirement, his house was not yet released by the government. Mr. and Mrs. Malik, with their son and daughter-in-law, live in a rented house. Mr. Malik fights with the government for the release of his house, but unfortunately, he fails in his efforts. He passed away without being able to live in his house even for a day. So, after his retirement, Mr. Malik fights with the government for the release of his house, but unfortunately, before the house was released by the government, he dies, he passes away without being able to live in his own house even for a day. So, almost 3 months after Mr. Malik's death, the house was handed over to Malik family. So, Mr. Malik dies, and after the death of Mr. Malik, 3 months after the death of Mr. Malik, the house was handed over to Malik family. Now, Mrs. Malik's daughter-in-law shows more interest to shift to her own house than Mrs. Malik. So now the house is handed over to Malik family. Here, Mrs. Malik was not eager to shift to their new house, but her daughter-in-law was very eager to shift to their new house. So she gets her new house painted and orders new furniture. The family decides to shift to their new house on Monday morning. But on that day, it starts raining heavily. But Mrs. Malik insists, since it was an auspicious day, ಒಳ್ಳೆ ದಿನ, Mrs. Malik insisted that they should shift on that day only. Insist ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಪಟ್ಟು ಹಿಡಿ. Hence, on Monday evening, even when it was raining, they decide to shift to their new house. They hire a taxi besides their own car and shift their house formally. Formally means ಔಪಚಾರಿಕವಾಗಿ. As they are moving in their car, Mrs. Malik is seen lost in her memories. She remembers all the pains she had taken while the house was being constructed. So, Mrs. Malik, as they were shifting on that particular day, remembers everything. She remembers the days she missed her meals, the days she stood in the scorching heat of the sun supervising the work in progress, the days she was drenched in rain. Everything she remembers. Scorching means ಸುಡು ಬಿಸಿಲು. Heat, ಕಾವು. Drench means ತೋಯಿಸು. So Mrs. Malik remembers everything as they are moving towards their new house. She also remembers the sketch of the house prepared by the architect. Sketch means chitra. It had the figure of the lady of the house standing on the veranda with her back towards the marble pillar. So that particular sketch had a figure of the lady, Akruti, Chitta, standing on the veranda with her back towards the marble pillar. It was an elegant and graceful image. Elegant means beautiful. Sundara. Graceful, Akarshak. Mrs. Malik had always felt that the architect might have painted herself clad in a maroon sari. So Mrs. Malik had always felt that the lady shown in that sketch was herself dressed in a maroon sari. Maroon means Kandu Kempu Banna. Many a times, in fact, many a times, Mrs. Malik used to stand before the dressing table and imagine she standing by the pillar. Imagine means kalpana. So many a times, Mrs. Malik used to stand before the dressing table, and she used to imagine that the lady shown in the picture was herself. In fact, many a times she thought of showing the sketch to her daughter-in-law, but resisted herself from showing the sketch. Resist means prevent, stop. Many a times, Mrs. Malik wanted to show that sketch to her daughter-in-law, but she never showed it. Her daughter-in-law was sitting on the front seat as they were moving in their car and was talking with her husband in English. Mrs. Malik did not like her daughter-in-law talking in English with her husband. As they were moving towards their new house, all of a sudden, Mrs. Malik felt that the figure in the sketch was perhaps that of her daughter-in-law. So as they were moving towards their new house, suddenly she had a feeling that the figure shown in that sketch was perhaps that of her daughter-in-law. But again, she questions herself, how could that be? Because when the house was being constructed, she was not there. It was she who worked hard while the house was under construction. Mrs. Malik worked very hard when the house was under construction. Now, when they arrive at their new house, her daughter-in-law stands reclining against the marble pillar exactly as shown in the sketch. Recline means Anu Ashrayisu. Now they arrive at their new house, and the daughter-in-law of Mrs. Malik, she goes and stands reclining against the marble pillar, exactly shown as shown in the sketch. It was really an unbearable experience for Mrs. Malik. Unbearable, ಸಹಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಲಾಗದ. She felt as if the architect might have mocked at her. Mocked means anakisu. She really felt very bad. And now, as she enters their new house, she felt very sick. She tells her son and daughter-in-law that she was not hungry and that she would like to sleep. Immediately, her daughter-in-law points out towards the room 10 by 8 and tells her that it would be her room. Her son takes her to the room. Mrs. Malik feels very drowsy, sleepy. Once upon a time, she had planned that the room would be for her mother-in-law, and now it was allotted to her. She is having that painful experience. Once upon a time, before the construction began, it was she who suggested that architect to have the size of storeroom 10 by 8. She wanted to construct that room for her mother-in-law, and now it was allotted to her. She remembers her dead husband. She thinks that already her husband is dead and shortly she too would die. Then She hears the comment passed by her daughter-in-law. According to her daughter-in-law, the house was very well planned except for a big storeroom. She would love to have a big storeroom. When Mrs. Malik heard it, she felt as if she was sinking deep and deep into a bottomless well. Well means Bami, bottomless, ತಳವಿಲ್ಲದ. So she is sinking, ಮುಳುಗು, deep into a bottomless well. There ends the story. So through this story, the writer tells us about the relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law in our society. All daughters-in-law should always remember that one or the other day they too would become mothers-in-law. Hence, they should never ill-treat their mothers-in-law. At the same time, all mothers-in-law also should never ill-treat their daughters-in-law.